Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of our KCS series. Today, we're going to be talking about KCS overview principles and techniques. My name is Tabitha Ishman, and I'm the marketing manager of Excalibur Data Systems. And I just wanted to welcome all of you to our webinar today and then talk about a few logistics before we go ahead and get started. The lines are muted and the webinar is being recorded. The recording will be sent via email to all participants on the line tomorrow, and then we'll answer questions at the end in a Q&A session. But you can ask questions at any time during the presentation just by typing them into the question window, or you can send it through the chat. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Excalibur Data Systems. We are a leading edge consulting firm guiding organizations through their digital transformation journey. We also work with strategic partners and leverage best of breed enterprise service management technologies. In doing so, we help create next generation solutions for our customers. And please join us as we continue this KCS series. So on the next slide right there, yes, our last webinar will be on December 17th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, covering KCS Techniques and adoption practices. So you can register on our website listed below, excaliburdata.com, upcoming events. So to kick us off, I'm going to introduce Mike Fuson, VP and Senior Solution Architect of Excalibur Data Systems.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second part, our second episode of KCS, and for this one, it's the overview and principles of KCS. In our previous webinar, we kind of covered the concept of KCS and why it's so important. I have with me Jonathan Berdyck from Excalibur Data Systems, one of our other senior solution architects and consultants. Jonathan and I had the opportunity to train together as certified KCS practitioners and are very, very excited to share with you our thoughts on KCS and why it is so important and how it can be so helpful to organizations as a knowledge principle. So I think, Jonathan, we're starting off with kind of a poll, right? Are you familiar with the concepts of knowledge-centered service, otherwise known as KCS? Tabitha will throw the poll up on the screen real quick here and ask you guys to tell us your level of knowledge in it, and we'll then move on. So Tabitha, if we could share that poll with the audience, that would be fantastic. So it looks like we're pretty well split. Some are quite familiar with it, some are somewhat familiar with it, some are unfamiliar with it. Well, we hope to be able to share with you today a good baseline for KCS as it relates to the general principles and practices of the knowledge-centered service architecture. I want to turn it over to Jonathan Berdyck. Jonathan, thanks for hosting with me again our KCS series here. So I think this is a review of what we covered in our last session, is it not?
Indeed, it is. Yep.
So we had talked about KCS really being the creation, reusing, and improving of knowledge via a converged collaborative problem-solving methodology. That in a nutshell is really what KCS is. It's about rapidly creating and making sure we're reusing and constantly seeking to improve knowledge. Content is created on demand, which is very different, as we talked about in our last session, than what so many of us who've been in the IT industry for a while, I'll just say, for many of us, more than a couple of decades, that you created it kind of post dealing with an issue, and then it went through some sort of approval process. And this is about creating it as it happens and making sure that it gets out there. So it's a big paradigm shift for folks when you're used to what was kind of the common methodology of knowledge management for so long. So Jonathan, let's dive right in to the KCS techniques and the solve and evolve loop process.
Sure, thanks, Mike. So we will spend a predominant amount of time talking about what KCS calls the double loop process. And the double loop process is illustrated on the screen here, and it's divided really into these two different loops. One is more tactical and front end, and that would be what's called the solve loop, which you can see on the right-hand side of the loop. The other piece is what's called the evolve loop, and that is the more strategic and more analytical side of the KCS methodology. The evolve loop really depends specifically on the solve loop being not only in existence, but operating in an effective manner. And the evolve loop really doesn't exist without the solve loop there. So we will move through the items that we see here, the techniques specifically listed under each loop. And prior to that, though, we will talk just very briefly about the kinds of roles that individuals play in an organization. So because we're going to actually talk in detail throughout the course of our time together today, how people function within the context of each of these practices and techniques. So the roles that people play in KCS are not necessarily related to organizational position. I mean, some of them can be, of course. You see the fact that we need leaders in this space. We're going to have leaders not only in sort of the typical hierarchy of an organization that are champions of what we're doing, but we're going to have leaders at all parts of this workflow. So we're counting on a collective leadership process to actually make the thing very, very effective. The roles that we'll specifically be referring to today are more in line of the roles that people play both within the solve loop and in the evolve loop. So the roles, for example, of the folks that would be more of the front line in the solve loop are under this knowledge worker header. And we have these three basic roles: candidate, contributor, and publisher. We will talk about what's called the license model later on, but these are all defined through what that is, how KCS defines whether you use one, two, or all three of these particular roles within the solve loop. Then you have some other individuals who in some cases are actually bridging both sides or bridging both loops. So you have what are called KCS coaches. These individuals are champions of KCS. They're experts in the process, and they're change agents. They are advocating for this. They're advocating for not only the methodology, but making it more effective and making ultimately the people that are playing the roles, specifically in the solve loop space, more effective in their work. Then we have domain experts who we rely on to not only provide us general expertise in various spaces in the organization, but we look to them to provide knowledge base health, meaning examining how our knowledge base is behaving, looking, feeling, and how much value it's serving up, and also being part of a content identification process, in particular identifying content that does not exist in the knowledge base but needs to. Okay, and then finally we have the KCS Council, which is we're really not going to talk a lot about the KCS Council today, but that is like a larger entity that helps guide the strategic initiatives as part of the KCS rollout, adoption, and maintenance as we go. So let's talk about the solve loop. All right, this is the more transactional side of the KCS methodology, and it really falls. We have 4 different pieces that are, or techniques rather, that we rely on as part of this loop: capturing, structuring, reusing, and improving. All right, so you can think of this workload as the day-to-day operations, the day in, day out tactical elements of working with partners in your organization, customers, people who need things from your part of the organization, just probably predominantly IT. All right, so these are the frontline individuals who are providing those services. So let's dive in now and take a closer look at each one of the various items here in the solve loop. So the first technique is the capturing piece. All right, we are trying to capture a holistic story and how the requester perceives what their need or issue is. All right, so we're going to rely on a lot of these principles that we talked about in the last session to help bolster and support the way we do this. So for example, capturing in the moment, we are one of the big design principles here is that we are capturing the knowledge on demand during our interaction with a particular individual. All right, so we're searching and we're identifying knowledge that might assist us in that process while we are listening and seeking to understand what the end person's issue is. We're not doing it after the fact. All right, we're not waiting until 5:01 when everybody else is gone and all of our workload is complete for the day and then trying to figure this out. We're doing it live in a converged workflow. So that doesn't necessarily mean, however, that we are just going to always be creating a knowledge article at the beginning of some interaction and working it completely, and it will be completely valid and valuable and have all the information that it could ever have in the article by the time we're done with that interaction. That's not actually true. We might not actually end up with an immediate resolution. Or a complete knowledge article, and that's totally okay. All right, that's the start of the value. Okay, and if it's worth sort of seeking a solution for, it's worth documenting. So that's what we're doing. We have to remember customer context here. This is definitely not easy to do after the fact, so we need to do it in the moment. And we want, while we are capturing this content, we want to make sure that, again, we're framing the situation in the end user's terms. And our job is really to listen, and our job is to understand, and our job is to document the need in a way that reflects how the customer would perceive that issue, so that ultimately we can make it findable. And we want to increase our findability in knowledge, because not only are we searching the knowledge base, but our intent is that those users who we serve would also be searching it. We need them to find it in their perspective, right? And then certainly searching here. So in the course of understanding what the issue is or what the need is, we are either creating something from scratch. If it already exists, if we find content in the knowledge base that might be applicable, then we are part of the validation process. So it's not necessarily true that we're always going to create an article. We might end up perhaps even modifying content or an article that already exists, or being able to use an article that's been created and validated and it fits the solution perfectly.
Jonathan, one of the things that stuck with me as we were doing our training on KCS practices is the concept of search early, search often. One of the key things, as you said, you don't, from the instant the interaction starts, start building that knowledge article. But from the moment that interaction starts, you're searching for that knowledge article in that customer context, and then not finding one, or you can then begin building one. Your secondary thing on capturing, though, maybe you find one, but maybe they've stated the problem a little differently and you're on point, and that's that improvement process around that article. But that search early, search often was something that really stuck with me as kind of the chant of KCS. Search early, search often. It's something that becomes just something you do as you begin that customer interaction, is looking to see, do we have a solution out there for them? And if we don't, then it's in a KCS world, and being a good knowledge worker, it's incumbent upon me to begin capturing that information.
Absolutely. Let's go on to the next slide there. So the structure of our articles, really, this is an important technique, although it should be said that the technology that you use to do this was really going to help you out with this. But what we're looking for, just not really so much different than some of the kind of the typical knowledge practices that we have, is that we want a basic breakdown. Issue, what's the environment that the people are working in, the resolution, the cause. We are trying to make it readable and findable. Again, a technology solution here is going to take the emphasis off the formatting and things of that nature. So that's a good thing. That's something we don't really want to spend a whole lot of time on. But our point is to really not overdo it here. As a classic overthinker, I would say this is much more of a mental position than a mechanical one. We have to sort of concentrate on keeping things simple and broken down easily. And so that leads us into the second point about completing our thoughts and not necessarily completing our sentences. Now that it's not necessarily licensed to have really bad diction and things of that nature in your articles, but we are not trying to be technical writers, even though we might be technical writers from a day-to-day point of view. We are problem solvers, and so we're trying to document in a way that not only captures in the customer's context, but just is brief and to the point and is consumable for everybody. One of the other things to take in this regard is that we really don't want articles that just go on and on and on and on and on. So we'd really like to be able to keep an article to a page in length. If it's any longer than that, then we really should be looking at, in particular, the context of the article. What is the issue really, or have we documented multiple issues in the article? We might want to break that apart into separate articles. That would contribute as well to the general findability of things, so that we can have actually distinct content that is delivered for actual different issues, rather than kind of having everything kind of muddled up in one article and having to dig through the variations of the context for the customer. So to emphasize what Mike was just mentioning a few minutes ago, the reuse of the articles, where if we were not to search and reuse the content, we would have a vastly different looking knowledge base. So we really do want to capitalize as much as possible on the content that's there. And we do that by searching early and searching often, so that we can establish whether or not the content even exists in the system. All right. So we would seek to understand the issue or the need at hand. We would then search under a multitude, perhaps, of different angles, different text, things like that, to see what we could come up with. Before just sort of creating an article just because we, just because we think that's the thing to do. We don't want to necessarily, we don't want to come up with duplicates. We don't want to be contributing content that's already there. We want to be making content better if it exists, or using it in its entirety. It's important to make a good distinction here that this is just a thing you need to do inside the workflow, right? It's not something you do, in your free time on a Saturday afternoon when you're done with work. It's part of how we get stuff done. And you don't always have to have an exact match here. We can often infer various solutions or resolutions from articles that are not an exact match. And that content, again, can be merged in, or a separate article can be created if needed to capture that content. So I've talked a little bit about seeking to understand. We can't really search well if we don't really understand the issue. So we're feeding our search with different terms, trying to make it as relevant as possible to ensure that we've come up with the appropriate content there in the system. And then finally, of course, when we find articles, or we actually create an article that is applicable, we want to make sure that we're tying it to not only to the workloads, but that we may also need to tie it to other articles. And this is kind of critical to the evolve loop efforts that is looking at the solve loop workflow from an analytical standpoint. And so it's not just looking at sort of one data point or two data points. The evolve loop is really looking at how well we are dealing with knowledge in whatever capacity we choose to take on for that particular situation. So, it's often said that if it's worth solving, it's worth saving. So that's why that's why this on-demand exercise becomes so valuable. Like if one person needs it, it was valuable, right? And we're hoping that more and more people it will be in demand, but even for that one particular solution, it was important to have. You can go on to the next one. Then finally, in the solve loop, we have the technique of improve. All right. In the previous webinar, we talked about some kind of typical knowledge practices that aren't very effective. One of them is what I like to call the grand knowledge review, where we schedule knowledge articles to be reviewed on a periodic basis. Whether or not they are valuable or they've been used is a whole other story. So what KCS espouses is that the reuse of the articles is the review process. Material is just going to naturally get reviewed because it was, like we said, it was worth putting there in the first place. So it has value at some level. But it doesn't need to be put on a review cycle just because. So this ought to give a tremendous amount of relief to people who might be struggling with how do we deal with 500 or 600 or maybe more articles that we accumulate. We don't have to schedule those out for a special weekend of review. We can just review. As it comes up. So it's my opinion that most review cycles like this are kind of they're like a waste of time. I mean, it's just not as effective. And And that's saying something for somebody like myself, who's kind of a just-in-case kind of person, right? I kind of like to cover my bases, but so that's again a mental practice. You have to be able to take that on in a way, and learn the technique as appropriate. We have this flag it to fix it and license to modify, and these are both role-based techniques as part of this improved process. All right, so it's why it was important for us to quickly go over the roles in the beginning, because ultimately, for example, in the solve loop, and we have the candidate, the contributor, and the publisher as the three roles. We want as many people to be able to actually publish and fix any article that's out there. All right. So we are either, if we are not so-called licensed, or we're at the candidate level in KCS, we do not have the ability to modify other people's articles. We only have the ability to modify our own. But at a contributor or publisher level, we can do that. So if you don't have the ability to modify, you flag. If you do have the ability to modify, you just fix it and you move on with life. And so ultimately, we want as many people as possible to be able to fix, so that we can be as efficient as possible with republishing content out into the KB. The other piece is this license to modify. KCS has this, what it calls the license model, and it's essentially saying you as an organization can choose whether to use within the solve loop all three of those roles, or whether you'd like to use maybe just the publisher and the contributor role, which often is the case. And that makes sense because KCS is built from a trust model. It's built from sort of a least restrictive starting point. It doesn't mean it's a free-for-all, but it means that, hey, what we want is people in our organization operating at the highest level so that we can publish content as effectively as possible. We really don't want people flagging stuff. Sometimes that's required for people that are being introduced to the methodology, but ultimately we don't want to do that. So we are operating from a least restrictive standpoint until such time that proves that doesn't work. All right.
I kind of sometimes think of it as a collaborative model, Jonathan, where the whole concept of KCS is trying to bring everyone into the fold to contribute to that collective knowledge. Kind of the primary concept of KCS is taking our collective knowledge and then improving that collective knowledge, because we see it all the time internally here at Excalibur. We're very collaborative as an organization. Somebody runs into a problem. Of course, I'm always joking with everybody, that sounds like a great knowledge article. But all of us will contribute. Well, somebody saw that error before. Here's something that worked. Somebody else saw the error and that solution didn't work, but here's another solution that worked. And that kind of starts to drive that reuse, review, and that constant improvement as a collaborative effort. And that's what's so important, and really what drives the power of what you can gain from the KCS methodology.
Yeah, and I think that the trust piece, just to finish that off, I think is very, very important, because often we talked about this a little bit last time, that processes are kind of put together from the point of view of the weakest participant, or the most restrictive part of how the process should work. And I mean, I've had experiences in other enterprises where I was the benefit of a highly trustworthy model until I earned my way out of that, because I could not manage to what what needed to be managed to. So I had access to systems that I could do very bad things to, and I was made aware of where those things were, and otherwise I was given what I needed to do the work, which is a very empowering thing. It makes you feel good, and that you don't have to, feel like you have to earn it all the time just to move up to the next step in the process. All right. So let's talk about the evolve loop now, the whole analytical side of our methodology. So the people that are involved with the evolve loop are really dependent on the solve loop efforts, okay? They are reflecting and learning and analyzing what's going on over in the solve loop. So that we can take what we've learned, and re-roll it in, so to speak, to the solve loop efforts in order to make not only what we're doing better, but help that process improve. Because the solve loop is doing that day-to-day capture, linking articles and sizing things up, it's important to kind of understand how effective the process is, how effective the people are, and how things are working. So that's why the evolve loop exists. It's divided into these 4 sections: content health, process integration, performance assessment, and then finally leadership and communication. So we're going to spend the remainder of our time talking about these 4 elements. So the individuals responsible for content health here in the evolve loop are concerned about article structure, whether things are findable, whether the article is good enough for us, whether it's usable by people. And so whether that's audience oriented, and we're not really worried about so much about formatting, but certainly length of content, that kind of thing. And we're then concerned about whether or not we're abiding by the life cycle of the articles. Typically, articles would move through a new state, then they would go to perhaps a work in progress, and then they would be validated or not validated, and then finally archived. So we're concerned about how the article content is being manipulated and whether the standard is being followed in those spaces, okay? We're also concerned about contributing content to the KB that might not necessarily make it there by itself. So the solve loop is all about the on-demand side, and that is kind of the predominant percentage of the content. But if you have the appropriate technology, you're able to actually look at search patterns, what people are looking for, and whether or not they are getting results back. And if they are getting results back from those searches, how valuable are they? Were people satisfied with the content? Did they feel like they didn't find what they were looking for? So we can actually work to supplement the KB when needed based on that information that we find. We also have to be cognizant of archiving old stuff. This is a hard practice because lots of stuff's coming into the environment. Lots of things like services are being retired. Keeping up with the content in parallel as much as possible is very, very important. Otherwise, we end up with a bunch of articles that don't mean anything or have no value because we don't actually do that work anymore, okay? So that falls a bit into this last point here on the slide, legacy data, although legacy data is more in line with if you are, in part, if you have been practicing knowledge management a particular way and you've accumulated all this content, what the heck do you do with it? And yes, so this means all the KB articles that you have now. We know what you're going to say about that. We've heard that several times. But we're not, the methodology does not espouse just deleting it and forgetting about it, but rather putting it aside. And we can harvest it if we need to. So oftentimes the people that are in the roles of in the evolve loop area will be assisting in that content process by maybe even pulling content out of the old legacy knowledge base in order to provide some context and additional supplemental information for things as they arise, out of the solve loop. So we do get to repurpose it if we need to, and that's a good thing, although that is, it's certainly, I think that kind of strikes fear into the hearts of people in an organization, just because of the kind of work that typically goes into compiling articles. I mean, in the Consortium for Service Innovation, which oversees the KCS methodology, they state that like upwards of 90% of all knowledge articles that exist, outside of KCS are irrelevant, and that's a really, really high number. I mean, like really high, and it makes you think about all the work that went into that kind of thing, and how, I mean, it's hard to believe that the number is that significant. So it's important that we don't discount that work, so we just archive it and put it in a place where we can get to it, but that we allow ourselves to start from a clean slate when we are doing the work, when we start the whole, when we implement the methodology. So we can, in the content health space, prime the KB with information. We're not talking about creating articles that we think will be in demand, but we are talking about specific type of content, like release information for various services or applications, maybe processes that have to be documented, that maybe people would be looking for, perhaps we understand, we know as part of our enterprise operations that that a particular large piece of enterprise software is going to be implemented or upgraded. We can supplement the database with with instructions and that sort of thing. But we're still not doing any sort of big data dumps, especially from our old legacy database, and we're still trying to make sure that we're creating that content in a way that is applicable and it's within the context of the user. We talked a little bit about knowledge domain analysis, so looking at the quality of the articles, evaluating what people needed but maybe didn't find. Then we're also evaluating the self-service success. So this is where a lot of technology will actually help us, because we can ascertain to a certain degree whether people found what they were looking for. With feedback from them, we can understand the completeness of various articles. Even down to really understanding how people navigate to find the stuff that they're looking for. Finally here, we have the one of two indicators in the evolve space. This is called the Article Quality Index, or AQI. This is part of the analysis that is done as part of the coaching in the evolve loop to better to help improve how the solve loop role contributors do their job. And so again, we are not concerned with activity, although these are certainly activities, right? But we are concerned predominantly with outcomes. And so on the right-hand side here, we have just a sample of what a simple article quality index might look like for various individuals. here. So people are being, as a group, we are analyzing how we do work and how we get it done, but for the purpose of really improving the outcome of the people that need the stuff that we have, not because we're trying to set up a great management review or anything like that. So a bit of a different context for that work. One of the other responsibilities in the Evolve Loop is the process integration. So we want to know just how much, how well the process is working, how well the Solve Loop participants and the process is structured, whether our participants are performing a sort of listening and then reasoning and then an analyzing kind of approach to how the articles are created or utilized. We are evaluating how our technology fits in or how it doesn't. And typically, we are looking for a KCS verified software application for sure, that can help us do the work that we need to do, especially from the analytical standpoint, but we are evaluating that and continuing to try to improve that. Same thing is true in that vein with how we search. We want to be able to have a relevant search, contextual search. We want to make things, we don't want to have ambiguous kinds of search results, that kind of thing. So we're always trying to improve upon the content that is delivered back from a search in order to be as effective as possible there. We want to continuously improve, so we are working to take what we learn as part of the Evolve process and roll it back into the Solve Loop segment. So that is in part also how the process adherence is done. So at a process adherence review is another kind of index, so to speak, of individual performance by the participants in the Solve Loop space. So I'm taking a look at opportunities to create or reuse or link articles, and how often we had those opportunities, and how often we made use of the opportunities, and then being able to improve ultimately the outcomes that we're looking to achieve. The performance assessment. So we talked a little bit about the licensing model. When we're looking at performance, when we're talking about the licensing model, rather, we are talking about whether or not we have kind of an appropriate breakdown of individuals that can publish and contribute. Should we change up how many roles we are utilizing in the Solve Loop space to increase our efficiency? Coaching is a very, very important part. These coaches are actually not only they can be part of the Solve Loop, but they are the expertise that can bring other people along. So they're the ones that are trying to, have the tide come in for our organization to increase our productivity, rather than just telling people, well, here's how you do it, and go read this manual and you'll be all set. No, we really need to have an interaction, a dialogue. We need to have sort of constant feedback, and the coaches are the people to do that. How we come up with coaches can be somewhat interesting. We do have to have the right people to do that. Oftentimes that's done by way of a network analysis, like a people network analysis within our organization, to figure out who's well connected, not only well connected, but who do we go to oftentimes when we have questions. Who is participating at sort of a much broader level in the organization, and oftentimes we can use that kind of analysis to help determine who might be a good candidate as a coach in our environment. And then obviously then assessing the value. We talked a little bit about the article quality index already, but that's done really by looking at activity trends and outcomes. If you've ever used a balanced scorecard approach, that really is it's the basis for this kind of work. We're not looking at individual activities as a specific measurement to how one particular individual is performing. We are looking at this from a holistic standpoint. And I think we have one more slide here. Yep. So then the leadership and communication portion of the Evolve loop, this one is pretty deep. I think it shares a lot of characteristics with many other enterprise implementations or large scale initiatives within an organization. But it is the part of the methodology that's setting the tone, so that our methodology and the way that we go about it is permeating throughout the people and the teams that we're relying on. So we're not doing we're doing things that aren't necessarily so outlandish, right? We're creating vision, motivation. We have a mission statement. We sort of have a standard for why we're doing this and how we're going to accomplish that. Our purpose in that, maybe even a brand promise, that kind of thing. We are working very hard to have a strategic framework. And in particular, ensuring that we're tying what we're doing in KCS to the larger organizational goals. A bit of business relationship management there, if you will. We're always looking at what kind of benefits we are getting and making sure that we are articulating those benefits, the return on investment that we are making. Then there's a lot of sort of very intrinsic, even personal pieces to this, our ability to work as a team, what kind of tone we are setting for individuals, how do we motivate the individuals that are participating, how do we recognize them for the work that they do, and being able to not only communicate clearly about what the expectations are and what our needs are, but also making sure that kind of in reverse, that our communication leads to accountability in the organization, that we're not just sort of saying things and not following our own rules, but we legitimately care about the process and we're sort of willing to put our money where our mouth is in terms of making the work that we're doing effective within the KCS methodology. I think it's time for some questions. I don't know if there's anybody that had any questions that we can try to answer at this time.
Yeah, Jonathan, we did have a few come in while you were presenting. So the first one that came in is, can individuals play more than one role?
Yes, they can. Now, although not in all cases, so there's a little bit of a caveat to that. You'll often find that individuals in the solve loop side of KCS are indeed playing just an individual role. They are either a candidate and they're learning the methodology, or they're a contributor, or they're a publisher. However, we do have the roles of like the knowledge domain expert We also have the KCS coaches. Okay, those are oftentimes roles that people are playing part-time, and they're not doing that as 100% of their work. They are participating not only in the solve loop activities, maybe they are a publisher of content, but they're also a coach because they have just emerged as a candidate or as a really good person or personality to be able to play those roles. So in some cases, yes, some cases, no.
Thank you. So I think the second question that came in is, does every role need to exist?
So the answer to that is no. Specifically in the solve loop side, when we're talking about the KCS licensing model, we are talking specifically about what kind of roles, especially in that space, does the organization really want to take on? So we find that some organizations really do want to have the 3 core roles: candidate, contributor, publisher. But some don't even institute the candidate. They simply make everybody either a contributor or a publisher. I'm not sure if people would just specifically do a single role, but that certainly is possible. It's certainly what we're striving for, is to not necessarily eliminate our roles, but to try to make the as top heavy as possible, so that we increase, our ability to push content into the knowledge base, and that we don't create a bottleneck. So we'll see a lot of times that organizations just make decisions about how many roles there are. It's very organizationally specific, just based on either their understanding of the methodology or, perhaps a particular organizational approach. You could also, as an aside there, I think evolve, to use a turn of phrase here from KCS, over time, to where you start off with a certain number of roles, and after a while you eliminate 1 or you eliminate 2, just as you go.
And then we did have one final question come in. Does anyone actually approve an article then?
So no, not really, not explicitly, although implicitly the individuals who can publish content are in essence saying, I approve this content, right? And that works from a trust model, least restrictive standpoint. We believe that you're competent, you have earned it, you understand what we're doing, and so therefore we trust you to publish content in there with, and by doing that, we are essentially saying we approve of the content as it stands. So no stamping of particular records like we would see in other places, but implicitly that approval is coming just based on the ability to publish into the knowledge base.
Well, awesome.
Yeah, it's just to kind of further that comment, Tabitha, there's not an explicit, you couldn't have an approval process. Like so many things that are best practices, this is a framework that's been proven to work, been proven effective. It doesn't mean that you couldn't add an approval step in there, but it is contrary to the best practices that are there for KCS. On the previous question, I had muted myself and tried to jump in, and Tabitha got out in front of me. Was in a lot of cases there are, it's like other platforms that you work on. In many cases, folks that are coaches, as an example, in our Evolve loop are also potentially publishers. So there are folks that kind of wear multiple hats within this overall structure, and that's not uncommon. I mean, generally your coaches should be somebody who is a publisher, because they're going to know what to look for. They're just a more evolved, more advanced publisher to be able to help coach and improve the AQI of the folks that they're coaching. And I think, Jonathan, in our next session, we're going to get a little deeper into some of the concepts of coaching, I believe, and what does that look like? Because it's a concept that you really you don't think about in terms of knowledge management today as we deal with it. Tabitha, are there any additional questions that have come in?
No, there was just those three.
Okay.
So I think we can. So I will go ahead and close us out.
Yep. You want me to go, or you want to go, Tabitha?
I'll go. I just wanted to thank everyone for hopping on the line with us today. And once again, just join us on December 17th at 2 p.m. Eastern for the third episode in the KCS series. We are going to be diving in to more of the adoption and techniques of KCS. And you can register for that on our website listed below. And I just wanted to thank Jonathan and Mike for being on here with us today.
Yeah, thanks everybody out there for joining us. We'll see you again, hopefully, a little later in the month.